I will present a presentation regarding to evaluation of oral swabs for FMD surveillance. Please, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to present to you a very, very simple study. It's not any particular high-tech study, but something that we undertook last year as a partnership between what was then CVI Lelystad, FLI at Insulrooms, and our institute in Australia. And I don't need to tell anybody in this audience that if you are undertaking surveillance in unvaccinated animals, that for pigs and cattle it's quite easy to detect clinical signs, and often clinical surveillance is, clinical examination is used as a standard surveillance method. When it comes to sheep, of course, our colleagues, particularly in the UK, can attest that sheep don't always show clinical signs, and movement of infected sheep can certainly result in an escalation of an outbreak over a very large area in the absence of any clinical signs. And so we're often relying on other laboratory-based methods to be able to undertake detection of FMD, whether it be serology or virus isolation on blood samples, or now real-time PCR and so on. And so over the last decade, many of you who followed the literature would have seen that our colleagues in the Netherlands have undertaken quite a large number of studies with vaccinated sheep and cattle, or combinations of cattle and sheep together, looking at transmission. And over this time they've collected a large number of samples, and some of them had been tested by real-time PCR, but not all of the panel. And so after one of these in one of these projects, they'd shown that you could detect FMD in oral swabs by virus isolation. They'd undertaken a limited amount of real-time PCR. And so I actually sent an email to our dear colleague Aldo Decker and said, Aldo, have you looked at these swabs in a high throughput format like we would use for surveillance of avian influenza or any other endemic disease, and is there any potential to look at pooling of these samples? And he said, well, look, these are really important questions. They're very basic questions. We do things pretty simply in Australia, but they're very basic, simple questions, very important. And he said, look, these are so important, if you wish, we can give you all of our samples. He said, and you can do the work. So that was the background to this actual study. And so we had to fish around and find out where we might be able to undertake this work, because Aldo said we can send them to Australia, but the quarantine people probably won't let the samples in. My now supervisor, Jeff Hammond, had said, well, we won't be able to go to Pirbright because, it'll take you guys too long to be trained. We talked to colleagues in China, they didn't want the samples, and on we went. So anyway, we ended up at Insulrooms with our dear colleague Bernd Haas, and I should mention at this stage, this was the actual last piece of work that Bernd was involved in. He left us in the middle of this project, and so it put this project under extreme pressure. So we discussed the planning of this project. We said, how are we going to pool these samples? What should we do? I spoke to the epidemiologists. Everybody had a range of ideas. Should we pool the extract? Should we pool the samples? How do we go about this? And so after this, we went through a fairly detailed planning exercise, as you can imagine. The German regulations are very strict on not changing any methods, and so we said we need to try and simulate what we would do in a routine diagnostic lab, use an internal control. We compared reagents and so on, and we managed to get these 4,000 samples shipped across from the Netherlands to FLI. And of course, they only took 4 days instead of about a day. And so Bernd was a little bit anxious for a few days. But what the aim was to use our routine high throughput methods where we're extracting nucleic acid from samples using a Magmax 96 RNA kit on a Kingfisher magnetic particle handling system, and using the 3D assay, our standard AgPath master mix. And our idea of using an internal control was it had to be something that was readily available to all labs. And so we then looked at considering pooling. What should we do? How should we go about this to take different stages of infection into account? So do we take a heap of samples at different stages and put them together, or how do we achieve this? So for those of you who've seen Bernds treatise of a couple of years ago on the residual infective virus in samples. Of course, what had to happen is that they had to go into lysis buffer, and these particular samples had then to be heated at 80 degrees for 20 minutes. Halfway through, the lysis buffer was already heated to 80 degrees. Halfway through the protocol, the plates were turned around to make sure there was good heating. They were turned upside down. And so this was a fairly complex process, but nevertheless, to comply with the German law, that's what we had to do. And it wasn't quite what we had in mind. And I know there's a presentation later on the use of other sample buffers to inactivate virus, because we had a similar idea that we could really inactivate these samples fairly easily. Don't worry about the detail, but this is our standard MagMax protocol on the left, and the yellow is the differences between what was used in the FMD lab, and so it was quite different volumes. And I was concerned that using larger volumes in some cases does not improve the quality of your real-time PCR. So if we're doing testing of semen in our lab, we do semen undiluted, but we only use 25 microlitres of sample, because if we do that, we can get around inhibitors and we get a better result than if we use 50 microlitres. So there were many differences in the protocol, despite our overall goal of trying to keep it simple and follow the standard protocol. An important aspect of this project was that there's been a debate in Australia, in the US, in Canada particularly. Do we do all of our FMD exclusions in a BSL-3 facility? And in Germany, like us in Australia, like the US, the consensus is that we will inactivate the samples but do all of the large volume work under BSL-2 facilities. And so that's what actually happened in this project. So the samples came into the BSL-3, the old BSL-3 FMD facility at FLI. They were put into sample buffer, they were heat inactivated, and then the same day they were transferred to the BSL-2 facilities where the PCR was run. And so we were looking at this in a high throughput format, and in a 3-day period there were 1,442 samples processed, despite this somewhat complicated protocol compared to what we would normally use. Now, in our environment, 1,442 samples in 3 days is not exactly demanding, and so my senior technician came at lunchtime. We'd have a long lunch, he'd finish early. It was a dawdle, as he described it. So he would, in an FMD, in an influenza outbreak at home, he would do 1,400 samples in a day with 2 assistants. And so what we're able to show is that we could, in this high throughput format, easily process a large number of samples. And from the German perspective, this was a really valuable training exercise for them, because they were not only able to show that in their facilities they could do a large number of samples, but the data was loaded into their LIMS system and so on. All happened in a 24-hour period. So just showing you some of the data. Plasma samples were available, so we did get plasma and oral swabs, but the virus isolation results had shown that virus was detected for short periods in plasma, so there's nothing new about that. The red bars are the PCR results, the blue were virus isolation results. Now, these samples, of course, had been stored for a number of years, so in some cases up to 10 years, so we don't know how good the quality of the samples were compared to what they originally started out. But you can see on the right-hand column the total number of positive samples by PCR is more than double the number by virus isolation. But because of this significant difference and limited detection compared to what had already been known about oral swabs, we only did the single set of samples by single set of plasma samples. Of course, when we came to the oral swabs, this was a 31-day sequential study, and you can see through that, without looking at the fine detail, that most of the sheep are positive throughout that 31-day period. So we can readily detect FMD. If this was a flock test and we took any one of those sheep, there's a very high probability that you would find positives. If you took 2 or 3, obviously you would detect infection in that flock. So positives and a high proportion throughout the 31-day period. Very little change in CT values. If you look at the median, which was the light blue, second from the top, that was sort of where they tracked, not much over that period. Coming to pooling, what did we do? So for the pooling exercise, after the debate, what we did was we actually took the day 0 samples that had been taken prior to inoculation of these sheep. And so we pooled that, the oral swab fluid from the original time 0, pooled that and then used that to dilute the oral swabs. So if you look at the first column on the left, they were the range of CTs there, all but one sheep is positive. This is taken on day 2. We took day 2 because that was the earliest time at which the majority of sheep were positive. And of course, when you look out to the right-hand column, at a dilution of 1 in 10, almost all of them are positive. Not all, but almost all. And we certainly have some serious reservations about this data in terms of the age of the samples, the way that the heat processing was undertaken. And so if we had fresh samples and using perhaps a different lysis buffer, the results may even be better than this, but that doesn't really matter. The take-home message was that it was very easy to detect on day 2 infection in samples that had in a pool of 10. And when you look at the CT values on these, some of these would easily dilute out to 1 in 1,000. There's no question about that. Real-time PCR is very predictable, and we can go through it quite easily and estimate what the likely outcome. When we go to the other end of the scale, we went to day 28 when a high proportion of animals were still positive. And if we look at those, we can actually find there that at a dilution of 1 in 5, there's very few samples that are not testing positive. There are certainly some negatives in there, but as a flock test, by and large, and this is a single animal, if you had a single animal in a pool of 5, you can clearly detect it. So if you have an infected flock, animals at different stages of infection, I would be confident that pools of 10, pools of 30, you will easily detect infection in this flock. And of course, we didn't have any opportunity to go back and repeat these studies because the pooling half of the experiment was in the second week of the project, and of course Bernd left us in the middle of it, so it put it under a little bit of pressure. Internal control, you can see there, this is a spiked exogenous control added to the samples at the time of extraction. You can see from that a very, very high degree of reproducibility. There was only 12 samples out of the 1,400 that failed, and we weren't able to go back and repeat those to confirm that it was actually inhibitors in the sample. We won't worry about that one for the sake of time, but the take-home message from this was that you can't necessarily take lysis buffers from one kit and then take that sample and put it in with another, because you can completely kill off a PCR. If you look at the second column from the centred block of yellow results, there's a whole series of PCRs with high concentrations of virus that are completely killed off because it's a lysis buffer from one kit added to another. So where do we go from here? What we need to do is look at some conventional extraction methods, ideally without heating, looking at the capacity for lysis buffers to infect, and we need to be able to undertake this if we can without heating the samples. And so with that, I'd like to certainly thank our colleagues at FLI for hosting us to undertake this study, our colleagues at Lelystad particularly for being so generous to make these samples available, and my colleague Rodney Davis from our lab at EMAI. And I'd just add one comment. Talking to Angus Cameron last night, why do we undertake pooling? It's all about economics. In developed countries, labour is expensive, and so our administrators want to see surveillance done at a very, very low cost. Collection of oral swabs from sheep is easy, pooling is not difficult, but if you're in a developing country, think about this differently. Labour is not a problem, so you can pool your samples easily, you can run your PCR, but now you might be doing one PCR for 30 animals. And so what appears to be expensive in the way of real-time PCR reagents will become much less expensive for you, just as in the developed countries, labour is expensive, and so pooling helps to keep the cost down.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just time for one brief question, please. So no question. Thank you very much. Thank you.